Despite their profoundly different ideologies and competing territorial aims, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin sought compromise, embodied in the pre-World War II Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In addition to the promise of non-aggression, the agreement also divided much of Eastern Europe between the two world powers. The treaty failed to prevent the inevitable conflict between Hitler and Stalin, and was dissolved by Germany with Operation Barbarossa. Because of this betrayal, Stalin grew wary of the West, which led to an Iron Curtain falling over Europe and an escalation of Cold War tensions. The First World War was concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty incurred harsh punishments on Germany for their role in the war. Most notable of these punishments were the country's reparation payments, which amounted to 132 billion gold marks, equal to $490 billion as of March 2018. To pay off the tremendous debts, the German government began liberally printing paper money. The result of this reckless printing was an incident of hyperinflation that had never been seen before, and the German economy was severely crippled. Meanwhile, the newly formed Soviet Union felt cheated by its allies. They were not included in the Paris peace talks, even though they had also fought against the Germans. The newly instated Bolshevik government refused to acknowledge Russia's debts to the Allies, and also published secret agreements between itself and the other Allies. Because of this, Russia was excluded from the Paris peace talks. Even in 1924, Joseph Stalin had strong opinions on the West, saying, "The Entente has proven capable of coping with the results of its war victories. It fully succeeded in defeating Germany and in encircling the Soviet Union." In the mid-1930s, Germany and the Soviet Union were on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of military power. On one hand, the Soviet Union's military was highly disorganized due to political paranoia. On the other hand, Nazi Germany had been making rapid progress in rearming and preparing for war, despite the limits on its military under the Treaty of Versailles. The two countries did share one attribute, however, a mutual hatred towards each other because of their political ideologies. The mid-1930s were a time of upheaval in the Soviet military. Due to Stalin's paranoia of being overthrown, the upper ranks of the army and navy were purged in an effort to remove those who might pose a threat to his power. From 1936 to 1939, the majority of all commanders and officers were either executed or sent to gulags. As a consequence, the ability of the Soviet military to function effectively was greatly hindered. With the loss of experienced high-ranking officials, replacements had to be hastily trained. These replacements were of significantly lower quality, due to their lack of experience. The German military experienced extremely harsh regulation under the Treaty of Versailles. However, one of Hitler's biggest platforms was the advocacy for the rearmament of the German military. Therefore, with his rise to power in 1933, Germany began rearming the military despite the treaty's limits. In this time, the Navy constructed dozens of new ships including U-boats, and the mechanized corps developed and produced swarms of tanks and self-propelled guns. Even though both of these actions were strictly forbidden under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany continued anyways. Using clever ruses and excuses to keep the Allies off their backs, the German military secretly became a formidable fighting force once again. These actions also showed, for the first time, that the Germans had no intentions of cooperating with the Allies. Much of the ideology of the Nazi Party was based on opposition to the communist movement. Hitler's rise to power deteriorated German-Soviet relations. He believed that communism was one of the ultimate evils, saying, "I consider Bolshevism the most malignant poison that can be given to a people." Their interwar relations mainly consisted of the countries denouncing the other's ideologies. With Hitler heating European politics to its boiling point, Britain and France became anxious. A conflict felt inevitable, and ensuring a security agreement with the Soviet Union was crucial in case of war. Talks between the West and the Soviet Union began, though very little progress was made due to mutual distrust between British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and Stalin. From Stalin's point of view, it seemed as if the Western powers were attempting to direct German aggression eastward in the case of a war. This was a reasonable suspicion, as France and Britain would only promise aid to Poland if the Soviets also signed on. Ultimately, the countries would fail to achieve any compromise. Meanwhile, Germany was slowly changing its view on relations with the Soviets. Hitler determined that he must seek a compromise with them in advance of the invasion of Poland, in order to ensure there would not be a two-front war, as in World War I. On August 19, 1939, Hitler received a message from Stalin inviting German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop to Moscow in order to discuss a pact. The pact was signed on August 23, 1939 in Moscow. It contained 7 public articles which established that both high contracting parties obligate themselves to desist from any act of violence on each other either individually or jointly with other powers. Also contained in the pact was an additional secret protocol which outlined spheres of influence of the two nations in the Baltic states and Poland, as this map shows. The pact was created and signed within a matter of hours. When he learned the treaty was signed, Hitler jumped, exclaiming, "We've won!" To Hitler, this pact was only an assurance that Germany would not initially be fighting a two-front war. Likewise, Stalin saw the pact as a way to create a buffer zone between Germany and the Soviet Union in the case of conflict. He also saw the pact as an opportunity to rebuild his military. Following the announcement of the pact, the worldwide reaction was one of shock. Leaders around the world wondered how two countries with such opposing ideologies could come to any agreement, let alone a non-aggression pact. Days after the signing, Hitler launched his invasion into Poland. Soon after the German invasion, the Soviets launched their offensive against Poland in order to occupy their sphere of influence outlined in the pact. In late 1939, a border dispute with Finland led the Soviet Union to launch an invasion into the country. However, the Finns were able to repel the invasion and inflicted at least 400,000 casualties on the Soviet forces over the course of 2 years. Because of their recent military disasters, Hitler believed that the Soviet military was weakened to a point where it couldn't recover. Therefore, despite their previous cooperation, Hitler dissolved the pact in June 1941, when the German military launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. In the ensuing months, the German army was able to push the Soviets back to their capital of Moscow. However, Hitler underestimated the raw power of the Soviet military and the citizens behind it. Despite the heavy losses the Soviets took in the opening months of the invasion, mass conscription and rapid production of munitions allowed the Soviets to stall the German advance at Moscow. Thanks to the brutal Russian winter, the Soviets were able to repel the German assault and began to push the Germans back to Berlin. The Red Army was able to push the Germans out of Russia and occupy Germany within a matter of years. With the war finished, the Allies now had to determine what to do with the devastated European continent. It was determined that the Western Allies would take responsibility for Western Europe, while the Soviets would control the majority of Eastern Europe. While the Allies were able to work together to divide Europe, the foundational differences in their ideologies ensured that any cooperation would not last. Stalin feared that his allies would turn against the Soviet Union, and seeing as how nearly all of the other Allied nations fundamentally disagreed with the communist ideology, this was not unreasonable to think. In the years following the war, Western nations passed several documents that were aimed at halting the spread of communism. In response, the Soviets stopped cooperating with the members of NATO, causing a conflict which led to the fall of the Iron Curtain over Europe and the escalation of the Cold War. Despite the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the effects of the pact are still felt. The residual post-war animosity between Russia and the West continues to create conflict between the two. Hitler never wanted a permanent peace treaty with the Soviets. His main motivation for signing the pact was to prevent the initial possibility of a two-front war. He would eventually have to fight the Soviet Union, as their deeply rooted ideological differences would not allow them to coexist for very long. Stalin's goals were aimed at protecting his country. In order to keep the impending war away from Soviet borders, he realized he must come to a compromise with the Nazis. Hitler's overestimation of the Soviet Union's weakness would be his downfall, and in the end, his attack on them would prove to be one of his greatest mistakes. After the war, distrust towards the Western powers would serve only as a wedge, widening the rift between NATO and the Eastern Bloc, causing the Cold War to grow warmer with every passing year. Remnants of this distrust still hang over the world today.